Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has personally apologised for her government's handling of a controversial extradition bill which sparked massive protests. Mrs. Lam says she accepts that her administration's shortcomings were to blame for the public unrest, but she did not cave in to demands for her to step down.
I have heard you loud and clear and have reflected deeply on all that has transpired. The concerns over the past few months have been caused by deficiencies in the work of the SAR government over the amendment exercise. I personally have to shoulder much of the responsibility. This has led to controversies, disputes and anxieties in society. For this, I offer my most sincere apology to all people of Hong Kong.
It's her second apology in a matter of days after the city was rocked by its biggest protests ever. The demonstrations began in opposition to the proposed extradition bill, which would allow suspects to be sent to mainland China for trial. But they evolved into larger protests calling for Mrs. Lam to resign.
Mrs. Lam's apology seems to have done nothing to appease protesters gathered outside the Legislative Council this afternoon, who greeted her speech with boos.
2 days after the rally, what we realized is Carrie Lam just chose to say sorry and that's all, and totally ignore the request of Hong Kong citizens. Now, she do not care at all. I would say that it's time for a lesson. It's time to have a lesson to let Carrie Lam learn what's meant by respect.
Protest organisers and Civil Human Rights Front also expressed dissatisfaction, saying Mrs. Lam's attitude was arrogant. They say they'll convene to decide on their next steps.
We are all very angry that Carrie Lam still refused to step down, still refused to withdraw the extradition bill, and refused to take the police or herself to be accountable for what happened on the 12th of June, where the police force used excessive force and condemned us as rioters.
Mrs. Lam has gradually softened her stance since the protests erupted. Here's how events unfolded. On June the 9th, protests first broke out. An estimated 1 million people hit the streets. Mrs. Lam's response was firm. She said the extradition bill would not be scrapped, maintaining that it would help to uphold justice and calling it very important. On June the 12th, the Hong Kong government was forced to postpone the second reading of the bill after demonstrators blocked key routes around the legislature. Things turned violent, with police firing tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters. The authorities declared it a riot. Mrs. Lam retreated for the first time, announcing that the bill would be suspended. Now, this past Sunday, an estimated 2 million people marched through the streets in the biggest protest Hong Kong has ever seen. Mrs. Lam didn't appear in public, but instead issued an apology in the form of a government statement, where she said sorry for causing controversy and disputes in society. It was too little too late, though, for protesters who wanted her to step down. Now, that brings us to today. Mrs. Lam apologising publicly in person as demanded. She said she would personally shoulder responsibility for the conflict, but stopped short of resigning.
Whether Mrs. Lam will or will not resign, well, as former LegCo President Zhang Yoksing put it, the resignation is not up to her. She is appointed by the central government, so for her to step down requires very high-level discussion and deliberation. The central government, at the same time, does not want to set a precedent that people power can actually depose a high-ranking Chinese official from his or her post. As a government pro insider said, was quoted as saying, it would create more problems than it solves at all sorts of levels, such as the resignation would send a signal of weakness on the part of the central government and also make future chief executive vulnerable to such public pressures, also making it harder to find willing and able candidates for the next election. So, while there's never been a precedent for a chief executive to step down, we did have a former chief executive, Tung Chee-hwa, stepping down months later after 500,000 people protested against the Article 23 national security legislation, citing ill health. Unpopular leader C.Y. Leung, who took a hardline stance against the Occupy movement, and some say it wasn't Beijing's first choice in the first place to be CE, he wasn't allowed to run for a second term.